Alan, it's great to see you. Thanks for coming on the Benson Wealth podcast.
Thank you for having me.
So today we're going to talk about ESG, which is a pretty hot button topic. Let's start with the basics because I think people hear ESG and they don't really understand what it is and what its implications are. So can we start with definitions, Alan, of what ESG is and what it promises to do?
Sure. Well, ESG is an acronym standing for environmental, social, and governance. And each of those three prongs contains distinct movements. So the E, for example, purports to address things like climate change, greenhouse gas emissions, biodiversity loss, deforestation, pollution, energy and water management, all those sorts of things. The S purports to address things like employee safety or humanitarian issues or DEI or abortion. And the G refers to governance. And historically, that was stuff like executive compensation or board diversity, management, and transparency. But increasingly, it is a proxy for the shift from the shareholder to the stakeholder model of corporate governance. And basically everything within the G pertains to that shift. The Business Roundtable in 2019 alleged to have redefined the purpose of corporations to shift from the shareholder to the stakeholder model of corporate governance. So in short, that's what ESG stands for. But in practice, ESG is very different. I think it is marketed and branded as something that's very feel good. It makes people happy about their investments, but it has a nefarious side that a lot of people don't pay very much attention to because people want to feel good about investing. People want to say, oh, you know what? If I can put my money into an ESG weighted portfolio, into a mutual fund or an exchange traded fund that is weighted towards ESG and make money on it, that's great. I can feel good about making money, but it's obviously not that simple.
So you said several things that I want to dig into. Let's start with the stakeholder versus shareholder capitalism. I had Sam Gregg on here, and we talked at length about stakeholder versus shareholder capitalism. But explain again, what is the fundamental difference between, say, the Milton Friedman sort of shareholder capitalist model versus the stakeholder model, and then we'll dig a little bit deeper into that specific subject.
Yeah, well, the Friedman Doctrine, so-called, has to do with an article that Milton Friedman wrote in the New York Times in, I believe, 1973, advocating the shareholder model, which is simply that corporations exist to maximize profits for shareholders. The stakeholder model is different in the sense that it redefines corporations to do other things. Profits are made for other purposes. Well, some of the stakeholders historically might be things that are obvious: customers and clients, employees, suppliers.
Sure.
But under the traditional shareholder model, any good business is going to cater to those interests. What's problematic is the shareholder model is way more expansive than that, and stakeholders become things like the environment itself or society writ large, amorphous categories like that don't have any concrete reference. And what's difficult there is that enables companies to, executives in particular, to do a lot of mischief, in the sense that if you have a company that is measuring performance based on profits, you can say, okay, revenue minus expenses, what are we left with? And are we doing better than we did last year, et cetera? But if you redefine the purpose of your corporation to something other than that, and you account for, any type of social contribution or any type of environmental contribution, then you can start saying, well, profits were down this year, but that's okay. We're still succeeding as a company because we are contributing to one particular social cause or one particular environmental cause, and we're checking those boxes. And even if we're underperforming financially, we are still hitting our benchmarks socially or by whatever other criteria. And that's problematic because a company is a legal entity that exists to maximize profits.
Correct.
That's just what it does. Charity and philanthropy are completely different things, and people can participate in charity, people can participate in philanthropy, and there's no problem there. Another thing I should point out when it comes to ESG investments is that private investors can absolutely put their money wherever they want to put it. If they want to put their money in ETFs that are advertised as ESG, by all means, they can do that. The problem becomes, in my view, the coercion that is inherent in the ESG project. I think that ESG is driven by governments and regulators and not by markets, not by private investors. And that is where we see, I think, compulsion come in, undue compulsion.
So talk more about that, because in one sense, I mean, look, it sounds nice for a company to say that they're not as concerned about, sort of the crass pursuit of just making profits. And I think unfairly so, Milton Friedman was very much demonized for that article that you were referencing. And so it feels and sounds good for a company to be really focused on stakeholders. Now, I have a big beef with that because I'm an employer and I run two investment firms. And I can tell you that if you think I don't care about my employees who are stakeholders, you're crazy, right? Like, of course I care about Katie, Lena, Pat, Miranda. I care about Pat and Tyler and Jason and Amy and Jeanette. Like there's several people in my orbit that they're essentially employed by me or my business partner. We can't run a business without them, and I need them to be happy. So I have a vested incentive to be engaged in my employees' lives. The other piece of it too is, they'll say things like, well, the stakeholder's the customer. Well, what do you think we're in business to do? Like, you don't think I'm not chiefly concerned about the wishes of my actual clientele? I mean, I know who butters my bread. I'm immensely grateful to my clients, and in many respects view many of those folks as family. And so I will say this: the idea that shareholderism doesn't care about stakeholders is a very fundamentally flawed thing, just right out of the gate.
100%.
Right. Now, let me back up for a second, because there is this nice feeling though. So whether it's like there's an investment firm, Eventide, that does evangelical mutual funds. There's Ave Maria, which was the founder of Domino's, that does Catholic-based mutual funds. There's Timothy funds. And then there are some old school sort of ESG strategies that were, I think, more genuinely concerned. I'm spacing on the names now, but I think in the early days had a more sort of really transparent and honest about who they were trying to be. And it wasn't sort of what I felt like was a bit of an end around, that was trying to promote socially conscious or environmentally focused investments. I don't have a problem with that. I mean, I have my own druthers on different issues, but if an investor cares deeply about investing in social causes, like, have at it. So I guess what would you say to that? Someone say, well, Alan, it's not a big deal. Why not just have people invest on their conscience? And why would we push back on that?
Well, there's a reason why the SEC instituted what's called the names rule. And I'm not a big fan of regulation, but I appreciate the purpose behind this regulation, which was to get after greenwashing. And what this rule essentially does is requires any portfolio that advertises itself as ESG to have within it securities, 80% of the securities matching the way it's advertised. So the issue is that all these ESG funds were doing very well around the time of the pandemic. And people started saying, wow, ESG is really a great thing. It's performing well versus the market. Well, it turns out the reason is because if you looked at the securities within these funds, they were not ESG related at all. And so this was what was called greenwashing, which is just essentially a form of dishonesty in which investors purported to have funds that were environmentally or socially responsible, but in fact contained things that weren't typically aligned with what we would consider, ESG integration. The other thing is that, if you just look conceptually at investment, I mean, historically, investment is based on two goals: maximizing profits and mitigating risk.
Sure.
And if that requires diversification of a portfolio. If you, from the get-go, are narrowing the parameters of investment and taking whole fields and industries off the table, then you are already narrowing the parameters of your investment strategy. You are limiting the possibility of diversification.
Correct.
And that just means that over time, mathematically, it's impossible for you to compete against the market. So what do you have to do if you're an ESG proponent? Well, you can increase the regulatory burden so that everybody has to play by the same rules, in which case ESG can perform versus the market when the market's only allowed, when the market's actually narrowed or restricted by government regulation. Well, why would any business want to do this? Why would anybody advocate for regulation? Well, the bigger the business, this is just basic public choice sort of analysis, but the bigger the business, the bigger the company, the bigger the bank, the more likely it is to want to reduce competition. I mean, this is just a fact of economics.
It is.
And by regulatory capture, in essence, you eliminate competition. You're able to squeeze out competition and ensure that the smaller firms can't afford the costs of regulatory compliance. And if you can make everyday business more difficult and more expensive for smaller and mid-sized firms, then you as the bigger firm can gain a competitive advantage over them. So that's one sort of simple explanation for why private firms, even publicly traded firms, might support ESG. But at a bigger level, sort of the macro ESG level, I mean, from the beginning, the Who Cares Wins conference that kicked off ESG was sponsored by the United Nations and the government of Switzerland. Of course, the United Nations gets roughly 75% of its funding from governments, which is taxpayer money, but not just from one country, from many different countries. And it is driven by governments, and the entire roadmap that developed out of that conference involves government intervention into the economy, whether through clean energy transition mandates, whether through economic incentives and subsidies for ESG, whether it's the UN principles for responsible management, any type of sustainability development goals, the UN Compact, EU has sustainable finance disclosure regulations. The SEC has instituted new disclosure mandates. There are a number of mandates coming down that require publicly traded companies to report on ESG data, and this is incredibly problematic. Now, one thing that I've tried to push back on is this idea that ESG is privately driven, that people are voluntarily entering into ESG. If you think about it, globally, there are about $100 trillion of assets under management. That's expected to be about $150 trillion by 2025. That's a lot of money.
Wow.
25% of that would be passively managed, but huge figures, right? Well, there are only just over 3,000 billionaires in the entire world, between 700 and 800 billionaires in the United States. How in the world can you get to $100 trillion with just those few private individuals? You really can't get there without the investment of government money. So we're talking about bonds, whether they're municipal bonds or other form of government bonds, whether it's pension money in the United States, that could be state or federal pension money, but we also have the pension funds of other foreign sovereign nations. We're talking sovereign wealth funds, oil-rich countries like Saudi Arabia or Norway. Many different oil-rich countries are investing their sovereign wealth funds. And that's how you get to those big figures. And there are certain institutional investors, asset management firms that are sort of leading the way. I think BlackRock and State Street are among the top 10 shareholders in 90% of the FTSE 100 companies. BlackRock is the largest shareholder in almost half of those. The big three, which is BlackRock, State Street, and Vanguard, are the largest shareholder in 90% of the companies in which they own shares on the S&P 500, and they own roughly 20% of shares in the S&P 500. So they're major players. And when they go in and buy shares of all these companies, then they're engaging as shareholders, and their shareholder engagement is problematic in part because of companies like ISS and Glass Lewis that do proxy advisory services and have essentially a duopoly, since they control about 97% of that market. And it's tough for companies like, for example, Strive Asset Management to break into that field and really have an influence on voting during proxy season. But at any rate, my point is that government money is where all this investment is coming from. It's where we get these astronomical figures that are unlike anything we've known before. Of course, trading has been around for a long time. Capital markets have been around for a long time.
Yep.
But unlike 100 years ago, where you might have been, retail or household investors, or your rich Aunt Sally putting money in her favorite companies or whatever, we have large institutional investors that are exercising unprecedented control over the entire economy and really lobbying for more regulations that enable more ESG, that enable, in turn, more concentration of power in these few companies. And by the way, some of these companies like BlackRock do have something of a revolving door in which a lot of their executives go out into government and come back in. For example, there's one individual who's on the National Economic Council who came from BlackRock. And you see a lot of what we would historically call cronyism when it comes to these asset management firms. As just an example, there was an executive order in 2021 that required basically ESG to be implemented throughout the federal government, but starting with these entities that control capital flows. So the Financial Stability Oversight Council was one of the entities affected. Well, that includes the Federal Reserve Board, the SEC, the Commodities Futures Trading Commission, and that executive order also pertained to the National Economic Council, the Department of the Treasury, the Office of Management and Budget. Clearly, this executive order was targeting financial sector, because if you can sort of control capital flows, you can control everything else downstream from there. You can really push ESG integration throughout the private economy through banking and financial services and investment.
Do you think that it's designed from a place of sort of what's the phrase I'm looking for? That they're socially engineering is what I'm looking for. Do you feel like that they're sort of weaponizing the financial markets, the capital markets, to engage in some sort of social engineering, or is it something different?
Well, I mean, I think when you're dealing with a movement like this, you have many different players with many different interests, and it's difficult to try to homogenize those and say there's a unified intent or purpose behind it. But I do believe, yes, a lot of people are after exactly what you're talking about. They realized that it's difficult to push social values through, litigation, through court systems, through legislation in particular, because you have to, we all know how difficult it is to get things through a divided Congress, whether that's the state or the federal level. But if you can operate through what is sort of loosely called the administrative state, it's a functioning like a fourth branch of government, in the sense that they're creatures federal agencies are creatures of legislation, but they're within the executive branch, and they contain within them their own court system, administrative law judges and the rest. So they operate with a little less accountability than other forms of government. You can't just vote out all the bureaucrats in an administrative agency. So yes, I think that there is sort of a theoretical effort by academics to try to push these types of movements. And if you go through peer-reviewed journals and law review articles. You can find one after another that advocates for these methods for ESG in order to try to, I'll say, encode elite preferences throughout society. And what's interesting is after the executive order I just mentioned, what immediately happened? Well, the Federal Reserve partnered with 6 large banks to seek consulting advice. Basically, how do we abide by this executive order? What do we need to do to follow it? Well, we'll hire the 6 biggest banks, which you could probably rattle off the names as well as I could, Drew, and
Sure.
what those are. And it's an interesting sort of self-perpetuating power cycle when you've got the biggest banks advising the Federal Reserve itself on how do we comply with this federal order. And I find that kind of stuff to be incredibly problematic. Now, having said all that, there has been a major pushback in the United States in particular against ESG because of issues like abortion, or people are looking at things like, why is Target advertising LGBTQ plus material to young children in their aisles, or why is Bud Light, Anheuser-Busch using Dylan Mulvaney as a spokesperson for its products when most Americans don't find those forms of advertising to be compelling. Most Americans don't see those commercials and think, this makes me want to buy from Target, or this makes me want to buy a Bud Light. And we saw a lot of pushback against both those companies. And you can find numerous examples, whether it's a company boycotting the state of Georgia for its particular legislation regarding abortion, or whether it's any number of factors, whether companies are paying employees to go to other states to seek abortion. There any number of social causes. Whatever people think about these issues, I think consumers get turned off when they find that whatever companies they like or whatever products they want to buy are tied to political causes, when corporations really ought not to be political. If you just think hypothetically, okay, the United States is divided roughly half and half. People who are socially conservative or socially liberal. Why would any company choose to alienate half of its potential consumer base?
I don't get it.
It wouldn't make any sense, but for, these regulatory regimes and compliance with these other, they've clearly done a cost-benefit analysis to say, look, we actually have less to lose by following these sort of social agendas than we do by trying traditional marketing to a broader base of people. But what I am concerned about is the bifurcation of corporate America into right and left. I don't think it's great for shaving razors or soaps or whatever.
Right.
Why are people buying those types of products based on their politics? Why do we go to a restaurant and make a decision about what type of straw we have to use? Why does that have to be a signal to everybody sitting around you of your politics? I think this is a dangerous a trend. The politicization of everything is dangerous because it inhibits personal relationships. It inhibits bonding at a personal level. We ought to be in a society where we can all disagree civilly and have friendships despite disagreements on politics, but it's becoming increasingly difficult because of the degree of hostility that accompanies politics these days, and that is driven, I think, in large part by social media.
And I couldn't agree more with you, Alan, that this is, I actually did an episode about, are we creating 2 economies? And that is the fear, right? Like, are we going to have a right-wing economy and a left-wing economy? Am I going to buy sneakers from the company that sort of presses the right buttons for me politically, and then people will go to the other sneaker company that presses their buttons? There's a societal fracturing that I think we're witnessing in real time. And regardless of what you think about any of these social causes, I just want a beer. Like, I don't need to be lectured about what someone's politics are. I've actually been in situations where I totally agreed with somebody when it came to their politics. but the form with which they were doing it was at a corporate meeting, and it was aggressive. And I just, the whole time, I agreed with what he said. I in some senses enjoyed what the individual said about this particular subject, but I was like, this isn't the time or the place. Like, people are here to learn about investment products. They're here to figure out how to retire. They want to understand, do they need to do more estate planning so that they avoid estate taxes? I mean, that's what's on clients' minds when they walk in the door. So even if I like the politics to kind of bombard someone or like throw it in their face through the private sector, I think can be quite obnoxious. And again, it's the fear that we're just going to isolate and separate individuals moving forward. That is very, 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 very problematic in my mind, and I'm glad you pointed that out. Anything else you want to add to that?
Well, I just say under more perfect competition, because there's no such thing as perfect competition.
Sure.
But under a more competitive system, companies which adopted political views that were offensive to a number of people or that alienated people would be punished in the marketplace for taking those views.
Yep.
But under ESG, because it's so governmentally driven, because it's becoming part of the administrative state, because it's becoming highly regulated, and because companies are being forced to participate in it, companies feel as if they have to move into a political direction in order to comply with any number of regulatory burdens. And that to me is wrong. And it's really been the goal of ESG from the beginning. Now, ESG is also, I'll just make one quick point before I turn it back to whatever you were about to transition to, but ESG has manifested itself quite differently in the United States than it has in Europe. In Europe, it really is principally focused on environmental factors, on sustainability, on green, whereas in the United States, we have tended to emphasize the social much more, issues of race, class, gender. That's not to say that board diversity hasn't been an important issue in Europe, because it has. That, just like we've seen the NASDAQ rule change where companies are having to report on board diversity, we've seen similar things throughout Europe. But interestingly enough, my colleague Siri Turgidson from Florida Atlantic University has done some research on Europe and what these board diversity policies have done for women, and they have ended up harming women in many cases, because the requirements to basically have meet board diversity quotas have ended up with women who were either unqualified or basically just purely political appointments onto corporate boards. So they're the spouses of politicians, or they're people who have donated large amounts of money to political parties, and then they get put on corporate boards, and they have no expertise in the field, and they end up either making bad decisions or basically just holding a titular position in which they exercise no say whatsoever on the company, and end up, in fact, making women look less qualified, because the most qualified women aren't the ones getting on the boards. The ones that are out there and have a ton of knowledge about the subject, or have a lot of experience in the corporate world, they're getting pushed aside for people who haven't earned it, essentially.
Well, and I often think of the unintended consequences of someone just being tempted to say, well, she's a diversity hire, right? Or there was pressure from regulators that they had to have a certain quota, as opposed to what if that individual, what if that woman is frankly the best? What if her reputation is being unfairly harmed because there's so many people that maybe got there because it wasn't truly based on merit? I think there's significant unintended consequences to people like that.
And social, I mean, it's a social consequence, and it goes both ways. So you have a social stigma against people, and this is an allegation leveled against affirmative action all the time, including by people like Justice Clarence Thomas, who say, I'm worried that people will look at me and think that I got where I got because of institutionalized privileges, that I didn't earn my way there. And on the other hand, you hear a lot of about imposter syndrome today and people feeling as if they don't belong. Well, that could partially be a psychological response to some of these forms of institutional privilege, in which people really are getting put into positions despite not having the requisite qualifications or experience, despite not having earned their way there. And when that happens, gradually over time in the aggregate, not only is there a stigma associated with people who sort of meet this profile of somebody that might have been, let's call them a diversity hire or diversity appointment. But by the same token, they suffer as well because they begin to feel as if they're not equipped to be there. Whereas something like a more level playing field, something that is more meritocracy, would enable the people to demonstrate their value to companies on their own terms and based on their performance.
So the narrative, Alan, as you know, is that people like you, and even people like me, aren't concerned about minorities or women or diversity within the workplace. They're not concerned about underprivileged individuals, and that's the point of ESG. And I know you've clearly shown that ESG is very much a government-driven phenomenon. But what would you say to people that say, well, we're at least trying to level the playing field, we're trying to make it fair, and you clearly don't seem very concerned about those individuals? How would you respond to someone if they level that accusation at you?
Well, I actually believe that diversity of experiences, diversity of perspectives are very beneficial to organizations. You need to be able to see your blind spots. You need people to be able to bring unique backgrounds to bear on problems. And that requires diversity. And I've been on hiring committees in which people were not specifically looking for diverse candidates or whatever, but the fact that somebody brought a different perspective to bear on the company or the firm or the university was a positive. It was a great positive. So, without mandates even having to be there, I think that people generally will gravitate toward what is most beneficial to the firm or the organization. And a lot of times that does involve diversity, because people want to know, for example, what might appeal to a historically marginalized community, or how different marketing or advertising campaigns might come across to a community that is speaking a foreign language and migrating to the United States, for example. How might that constituency or that demographic view these products? All those are great questions. And in a more globalized world, they are ones that are unavoidable for any company or any university, any business whatsoever. So I think that people are going to pursue forms of diversity regardless of any sort of governmental mandate. And it just so happens that I believe viewpoint diversity is probably the most valuable form of diversity to a firm. And it just so happens that viewpoint diversity tends to fall along the lines of demographic, ethnic, racial diversity as well, because people do gravitate towards cultures in which they feel at home. And a lot of times, that might be, they say that the most segregated hour in America is Sunday at church. African Americans tend to prefer to worship in African American churches, in particular in the Southeast, and that's not because of any sort of institutional form of segregation from the past, but because of just pure preference. They have their own historical traditions and forms of worship that they want to celebrate, embrace, and continue. It's a form of self-segregation, of voluntary segregation. But anybody that wants to sort of, just to use that example, since we're going to use a religious example, anyone who wants to spread the gospel, so to speak, has to learn different forms of worship, different forms of communication, being all things to all people, as Paul put it, and that demonstrates why the Christian church just happens to be probably the most diverse institution on the face of the earth.
It's so
People
true.
from
Spot on.
all different ethnic and racial backgrounds, people from Africa, from South America. I mean, this is where Christianity is spreading most rapidly is Africa and Asia.
Yep.
And not in, Western Europe or the United States.
No.
And I just find that to be interesting. It wasn't because of a message of diversity. It may have been, it's a unifying message, but one that is presented in a diverse ways. But the message itself is one of unity.
It is, and I think I mean, I'm a Christian like you, so I presume you are, Alan. Just hearing you talk, I think the gospel is an incredibly unifying, peaceful, and powerful message. And I always marvel when I go into churches, and I think the narrative is that you walk into a typical church, and you're going to see a bunch of WASPs in there, right? It's going to be a bunch of white Anglo-Saxon Protestants, and the reality is that I walk in and I see people from every culture pretty frequently in churches throughout America. And whether it's Brazil, which has a huge Presbyterian contingency or Catholic contingency, or it's Asia. So we're Presbyterian, and Presbyterianism is exploding all over the globe. And it's because the message of the gospel, I think, is appealing to individuals. And so these diverse groups, to your point, are consolidating around the core ideas of the Bible. And therefore, it brings a great amount of diversity. It's funny you said that, because this is something I think about all the time, is how Christianity has had that reputation. I think one of the ironies, though, of ESG is that religiosity in any form is really not even considered in these ESG measures at all. Would you agree with that?
Yes, I would, and in fact, because of sort of traditional biblical views of institutions like marriage, if anything, a lot of Christian organizations or strategies that companies might take would be disfavored under ESG. However, I do think issues like religious freedom and under the humanitarian sort of prong, there are like under the S, there are countries that are committing human rights violations that are sometimes based on religious factors, and that would sort of discredit companies coming from or investing in those places.
Sure.
So there is that element as well.
So I want to go back to stakeholderism, because I think that's an important distinction with this entire discussion, shareholder versus stakeholder. So my understanding, and this is something that Sam Gregg brought up on this podcast, is that there isn't a clear definition of who the stakeholders are. Like there's 450-ish, roughly, different types of stakeholders. Can you talk about how nebulous stakeholderism is, how many different stakeholders there are, and that whole side? Because I think that's an important component to the ESG discussion.
Sure. Yeah. I like to look at the Silicon Valley Bank ESG report that came out before its collapse, because you get to the E and the S and it's sort of clear what they're talking about. And then you get to the G, and everything in the G refers back to instituting ESG. So like its whole governance model is we're going to institute ESG. We're going to institute ESG. Well, that's sort of circular. Like that's not actually a form of governance. Under stakeholderism, that the stakeholders really, as I mentioned earlier, can be anything. It can be society writ large. It can be climate. It can be the environment. And as I say, that's problematic because it enables too much wiggle room for executives wishing to push some things under the rug. I think it enables greenwashing as well. There's also something called woke washing, which is a sort of a different iteration of greenwashing in which companies purport to embrace woke policies, but in fact only do so nominally and not practically. So, the difficulty with pursuing something as nebulous as stakeholders, when stakeholders can be defined in any way possible, is that you are actually giving companies leeway to get away with bad acts, when in fact the G prong is supposed to be all about transparency and cracking down on bad acts. I mean, after the 2008 financial crisis, ESG was pushed as a marketing PR effort by financial institutions, in part to prevent further regulation. Or when we had the financial crisis, people were talking about throwing bank executives in jail for their heavily risky activities, everything associated with mortgage-backed securities. I mean, people were really angry, and financial institutions that previously had not bought into ESG, which was only at that time sort of a publicly popular term for a few years, were now all of a sudden going to embrace ESG to try to head off consequences for what happened, all the actions that led to the financial crisis.
So it's a PR stunt, is basically what you're saying.
I think so. Yeah, I think largely so.
Yeah, I want to back up for a second, and I'm glad I remember this. There's a lot of talk about like diversity within the workplace, and I think Thomas Sowell is the greatest at writing on this and explaining this. But I think the most powerful thing about markets is that there's a cost to discrimination. Like there's tangible costs to be a rotten human being, and the markets will punish you. And that's the bummer about the profit and loss system. Is we think all day long about profits and how people get greedy, and this is why I'm a shareholder capitalist. But the thing about losses, Alan, and you know this better than anyone, the thing about losses is they hurt, and they can run you out of business, and you're not going to make a lot of money, and that's called discipline. That's what losses do. Now, there's a certain point where, and I think a Jackie Robinson is really the sterling example of this. There's a certain point where the LA Dodgers realized they could start beating other teams if they could put aside some of their nefarious, nasty viewpoints. And my take on it, this is my take, and I think Dr. Sowell would agree with me, is without markets, you don't have the Jackie Robinsons. Without markets, you don't see black CEOs today. You don't see women at the top. Like, it's markets that got all these people to where they are, because what had happened is human nature is human nature. And there became a price tag to actually discriminating against people. I think what is sort of counterintuitive and even oxymoronic about the ESG movement is that it's actually reducing markets. It's distorting markets based on everything that you just said, right? Markets are now being distorted, and because markets are being distorted, that's going to lead to, I think, a more of an oppressive environment for minorities. That's what I think it could lead to, a more oppressive environment to women, because now we're reducing the marketplace itself, and I see that as being very ironic and problematic. How do you feel about that?
Well, a few things. First is that markets elevated people out of poverty and brought foreign countries into economies that previously they had no access to. It improved the quality of life and generated growth and prosperity in places where those were lacking. And that added diversity to sort of the global marketplace, the global economy. Also, ESG disproportionately impacts poorer nations.
Does it?
For example, I have many friends down in Guatemala, and they complain about the impact of different climate-related regulations from Europe and the United States on their economy because, for example, if you are a poor person in Guatemala, you can't afford to go out and buy a Tesla. You can't afford to do all these environmentally green initiatives. They're just prohibitively expensive to you. And a lot of these costs fall on poorer countries. And there is, in that sense, a tension between the E and the S. When
Interesting.
the environmental regulations impose costs that fall disproportionately on those communities that can't afford to bear them, whereas rich countries like the United States or Europe can afford to comply with a new regulatory regime. These other countries cannot. They cannot just instantly adopt solar power, or they cannot. Nope. They cannot just get rid of whatever forms of basic utilities or energy they use, and so many of them are already dependent on richer economies and nations, and they bear this burden of costs that get passed on to them. So that's highly problematic. And one last point on diversity, in terms of the way it is taught, say, by HR people, the DEI. The reason why DEI is problematic is because it fundamentally teaches that people are inherently racist or wrong based on the color of their skin, which is an immutable characteristic, something they did not choose. Whereas somebody's views should be deemed racist or not based on what they actually say, the intent behind them, the actions people take, rather than on what people look like, the color of their skin, something that they can't help. That has nothing to do with somebody's agency, with somebody's intelligence, with somebody's thoughts. It has only to do with surface level characteristics.
I felt significant pressure in the industry to promote DEI, in particular and ESG. At one point, I've even told people that, hey, look, you're violating my moral conscience here, because what you just said, Alan, is how I feel about it. I'm not going to judge someone based on the color of their skin. I don't know if that rings a bell for people who are listening, but there's a great man who said that one time. But on the content of their character, and I really do think he's rolling in his grave right now. And so if I'm just going to blanketly say that someone has they're part of a systemically racist institution, or that they are inherently a bad person because they were born with a particular skin color, I mean, that just reeks of everything that the old school racists used to also engage in. And so to me, it's a violation of my conscience for me to promote DEI, because I believe in basic virtues, right? And I think you do too. And I think religiously and philosophically we're on the same page here. But I believe that people are created in God's image. I believe that people have inherent dignity. Even if I disagree with their lifestyle or their viewpoint, there's an inherent dignity that exists with all human beings. And because there's inherent dignity, I have a moral responsibility, even when I disagree, to treat them with respect. But DEI doesn't really preach that. And I think that's what people don't fully appreciate or understand, is that you're encouraging people to write off an entire category of individuals because they were born into sort of this systemic racist viewpoint, when we all know that's just not true. And so I think there's a DEI and some of the CSG stuff, there's some ethical problems that need to be owned up to, don't you think? Because I think there's serious ethical issues. And you brought something else up that I think is also very important, is I also view it as a wealth transfer from smaller institutions to larger institutions, right? So you can't take on the cost, because this is rent seeking, as we know in economics. You can't take on the burdensome costs. It's called barriers to entry. So there's barriers to entry now, because I'm running two smaller firms and I can feel the barriers to entry. So there's one, is it prevents competition, which leads to, I mean, for goodness sakes, Alan, some of these major banks that led us right into the crisis are now some of the biggest proponents of this, right? And so I guess just a stroke of irony that now more money is being consolidated with some of these bigger institutions when it seemed like yesterday or 3 seconds ago they're supposed to go to prison. So that's one problem I have with it. And then the other problem I have with it is the nation thing that you also point out, which I think is highly important, is that there's a wealth transfer from poor nations to rich nations. There was an initiative, and I forget which country it was. There was an initiative in Africa to promote solar panels. Well, did you know that in this country, 90% of residents don't even have electricity, period? And in many of those instances, they're burning dung in their huts to actually stay warm. So there's a humanitarian and a human rights problem with this as well. And if we care about poor people, we would care about implementing markets to get them ahead. So doing the feel good, we're going to put solar panels out there when it will actually probably won't bring any power. Women don't even have washing machines in most of these countries, right? They don't have access to clean water in most of these countries. And you know what would give them access to clean water is potentially, as much as people don't want to hear this, is maybe a coal plant. Or like let's advance them to the next thing. Maybe it's natural gas. Maybe they should be pursuing nuclear. But this idea that we're going to feel good about ourselves and we're going to put solar panels on the ground, it's not even necessarily ethical. And that's what's so frustrating about this is ESG and DEI is pitched as being this highly benevolent, highly ethical, highly noble, highly virtuous thing. But then when I look at, but what is it actually doing? I actually don't see I don't see any of that, frankly. And I'm presuming you agree with me on that.
Oh, I totally agree. And it's interesting that people attribute the growing gap between the rich and the poor to capitalism, when during the period in which that gap has grown the most, you've seen growth of government, the expansion of government, expansion of regulation, that has been really magnificent. And if anything, that sort of solidifies or rigidifies the class distinctions rather than what occur under market competition. Yeah.
So there is pushback though, right? So I mean, I'm doing my subtle little pushback here. You're pushing back. There was outcry over some of these companies that have really gone political, heavily political. Do you think there's a genuine counter movement that's existing? Are you hopeful about the future? And then what do you recommend specifically, Alan, to consumers, to investors? What's a rational way forward to make the world less politically toxic, I would say?
Well, I'll say a few things. I think that the pushback is real. You can Google some titles about ESG investing and dying. I think CNN has one about ESG investing is dying. That's not a bad thing. ESG investing is dying on Wall Street. Here's why. Morningstar, ESG is starting to fail. A lot of different headlines you can look at. But if you look at even things like JP Morgan Chase, BlackRock, and State Street dropping out of the CA 100 Plus, which is a global investor coalition for climate emissions, that together removed about $14 trillion of assets from that.
Wow.
$4.3 billion was pulled from ESG ETFs in 2023. A bunch of ESG labeled ETFs were liquidated in 2023. We had protests among European farmers and about ESG, how it affected their livelihood. The Russia-Ukraine war forced Germany to go back to nuclear because Germany had been reliant on Russia. So we've definitely seen some changes. But one thing I want to say about ESG, again, this goes back to the psychology, is globalization hasn't changed our nature as human beings who are tied to distinct communities and communicate with preferred languages and identify with specific regions and cultures. In that sense, we're still bounded creatures. Mm-hmm. And ESG, if you search the term global governance, go through any university library and click through their articles, or go into Westlaw or LexisNexis and search the term global governance, you'll find several articles popping up about that being a goal of ESG, and the World Economic Forum is just one entity that promotes that term. Well, I think part of the reason we see so much populism is individuals feel they lack the agency to facilitate change in the face of these massive powers. They look at these big banks and these asset management firms that have so many $trillions of assets under management, and they think, I can't do anything about that. I'm just me. I'm just a person. What am I going to do? Go, I can cast a vote at the ballot box, but, what can I do? Well, in the aggregate, everybody has to make conscious choices about what they're going to do. I'm actually about to withdraw my deposits from Truist and put them in First Bank of Alabama, and I have several reasons for doing that. I'm not saying everybody should go out and withdraw their deposits. I don't want to cause some kind of bank run or anything like that, but I have reasons for wanting to invest where I feel that my voice is recognized. And I do think that the ESG movement is hurting right now. I know in Alabama we passed something called the Economic Boycotts Act, and the bankers' lobbyist tried to cast that bill when it was SB 261 as something that was anti-free market, like, oh, this is government intervention. But in fact, what that bill prohibited was two things. It prohibited state contracts with companies that boycott particular industries. Basically, it prohibited state contracts with companies that were doing ESG, and it prohibited state and local government mandates to boycott certain industries. So what it was really doing was saying you can't use public money to do all this other bad stuff. It wasn't a restriction on private firms. It was a restriction on public money.
Right.
And that's an entirely different thing. But yes, the pushback is real. You look at the economy of Texas and Florida, those are massive, bigger than many foreign nations' economies. And when they act in concert with states like West Virginia or Oklahoma or you name it, then there is a tremendous ripple effect throughout the world. We may not have time to talk about it today, but the big danger out there is something with the European Union's Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, the CSDDD. That's very problematic and maybe a conversation for another time, but it seeks to regulate United States companies with European Union law, and it's a threat to our national sovereignty, frankly.
Yeah, wow. I don't think, and this is why I wanted to have you on today, is I don't think people appreciate kind of Oz behind the curtain and what's really happening, and that much of this is used as a way to consolidate further power. It's I'd say an insidious way to promote the agenda of, say, governments at times, and that's not what the markets are. And so I want to make a couple points too. You'd said a few things, and I'll go through them quickly. I was in the south of France with my wife a few months ago for our wedding anniversary, visiting a friend out there and his wife. It's actually my wife's best friend. We were out there with them and her French husband, and every little town, Alan, the signs were turned upside down. When you go into a little French village, you'll see the sign upside down. And then when you leave the village, you'd see the sign upside down. I said, Clement, what's this all about? And he said, it's all the French farmers, because so much of the food comes from the south of France. All the French farmers are revolting against basically Paris, and they're revolting against Brussels, because they're imposing all these standards that are completely... Here's another tragedy that people don't think about. It's suffocating an entire medieval culture, right? I mean, we would go into these little villages, Alan, and there were these old, 1,000-year-old stone buildings. And much of the south of France was untouched during World War II, so much of it's preserved. And when you impose these onerous rules that aren't based on actual real farming methods that work, what you're doing is you're crushing centuries and centuries and centuries of French history, and you're crushing what is deemed one of the finest cuisines on the universe. And there's sort of a French Revolution kind of thing happening here, right? Where we're wiping away. So there's cultural ramifications. And what if it's not a Western European nation? What if it's a poor nation and we're wiping away their long history of culture that matters? And so this is the law of unintended consequences of these things that I care very deeply about. Now, that said, the other thing I'll comment on is client after client after client after client comes into my office and says, I don't want ESG in my portfolio. So more and more people are coming in and they're saying they don't want it. And interestingly, I even run into people that are left of center that also are asking for it not to be there. And so I'm seeing a shift there. But I still think there's a place for socially conscious investing. So I was thinking about, as an advisor, and I'll be somewhat brief, but I want to make one final point and I want to hear your feedback. I keep thinking about advisors in my industry. There's a lot of talk around acting in a fiduciary capacity. And there's rules that have come down from the Department of Labor and from the SEC, et cetera, best interest contract. So I have a ethical and moral responsibility to act in my client's best interest. If I impose my private political sort of druthers on somebody else, and I know that would violate what they want, don't you think there's an ethical problem that exists there, right? Like, I think I have a moral responsibility. I have my own views, but it's their money. And I have a responsibility to do what I think is in their best interest based on what they want their money to do for them. If I say, I'm going to ignore everything you just said, and I'm going to put you into all these, my socially conscious stuff. And I've heard people in the industry, come through my office, advisors, and they had a whole axe to grind, and they were imposing their political values on clients. And I do think that is an ethical problem as well. And then I just think, look, if it was driven by the free market and there's socially progressive mutual funds and socially conservative, like, great, like, that's awesome. That's opportunity. That's the market delivering different options. But what you've pointed out today is this really isn't being driven by the market. This is really being driven by market oversight. But again, just to stress, I think there's an ethical question that we have to ask as wealth advisors in the industry is, where is our moral responsibility? Is it to promote ESG strategies to our clients, or is it to slow down, ask them questions about what is valuable to them, and to then implement strategies that are in accord with their personal values? Because I have clients probably evenly distributed on the left and the right, and I care about them equally, and I want them to be happy, and I'm trying to remove the political toxicity within my practice. And so my hope is that more advisors would think like that we have an ethical responsibility to do what's in their best interest. And you're a lawyer, so here's my question to you. Do you think there's some conflict between pressures around best interest contract, the fiduciary standard, and therefore promotion of ESG investments? And how do you feel about that?
Well, first of all, I commend you for your approach. I think that's exactly what you ought to be doing, pursuant to historical fiduciary duty obligations. Where the problem comes in particular, is with ESG investing in, for example, public pension fund investment. I mean,
Sure.
Asset managers investing public funds must act as agents representing the interests of their principals, which are the beneficiaries or pension fund participants.
So not the government, even though it's a public fund, they're acting on behalf of the pensioners.
Right, which, there are numerous pensioners, and the duty has become more complex with the rise of ESG because, to fulfill their fiduciary responsibility, investment managers overseeing pension funds must elicit input from beneficiaries before voting proxies or engaging with portfolio companies on ESG matters, and most don't. But divesting public funds from industries based on ESG criteria could also alienate beneficiaries who support those industries. If you're a public fund manager, you risk beneficiary backlash by pursuing socially motivated investments or engaging with portfolio companies on controversial environmental or political issues. Because if you're of all those numerous beneficiaries, they can't easily exit or transfer their retirement savings. It's hard to opt out of that system, if you're a public school teacher, or whatever, you're not following the way your state financial officer or comptroller or whoever is investing your your retirement savings that you've been putting away for years and years and years. And that's where I think things become difficult. Let's say you're an asset management firm. How do you represent the interests of tens of thousands of beneficiaries when obviously they're not a homogenous group?
No.
They have a multiplicity of interests and goals and values. And one ESG investment strategy can't capture all those contradictions that exist within that pool of people.
And that's why the shareholder model, by the way, that's why the shareholder capitalist model actually does make the most sense. What Milton Friedman was getting at, because ultimately what is the responsibility of these asset management groups that are running pensions is to maximize returns to the people that are trying to get through retirement. And if they're doing anything other than that, because it is not a homogenized group, then I think there's a possibility that they're in breach of their fiduciary standard, right? Right.
A lot of these fiduciary laws are local. They're state based, and it's ESG risks undermining the pluralistic and diverse approach to fiduciary duties and state pension fund investments within our federal system. Especially, how do you comply with state laws when all these federal regulations are tying compliance measures to international bodies like the United Nations, or these non-governmental organizations, the NGOs that are trying to standardize ESG metrics and practices globally? How do you deal with that when you're in a state like Alabama, for example, that's not the most populous state out there and not the richest state out there, and yet somebody's trying to invest pension money? And how do you do that to comply with all these major supranational bodies that are pushing investment strategy?
So I have a final question for you, and then we'll wrap here. And I really appreciate your time today, Alan.
Yeah.
So you have a PhD in literature, correct?
I do, yes.
And you have a JD as well, so you're trained as an attorney. So how does, by the way, literature sounds way more fascinating than ESG. I love to read. So
it really is. I don't know how I ended up doing what I'm doing here.
How did you go from being a literature guy to then an attorney to in the world of learning about exchange traded strategies and asset management firms? I think we're a little boring, my friend. So how'd you get here?
Basically, through a series of accidents. I wanted to be in academia. I was practicing law. I was actually an attorney when I got my PhD in English, and finished it while I was working for the Alabama Supreme Court, then jumped over to the Alabama Attorney General's office and worked for Luther Strange when he was AG. Had an opportunity to jump into higher ed, which I'd always had one foot in, one foot out, but jumped into Faulkner University, Thomas Good Jones School of Law in Montgomery, which is a Christian law school, and became an administrator right off the bat. But had been free market for some time, and had coordinated educational programming throughout the state and country, and gradually developed a reputation for doing that. And as I came to run the Manuel H. Johnson Center for Political Economy here in Troy, I was looking for new areas of focus for us. And through, again, a series of accidents, ESG was what I was reading about, and I started digging, and the deeper I dug, the more I realized that there actually are, I won't call them literary, but they're broader based questions that are humanities kind of questions that we would want to ask ourselves that are implicated by ESG. ESG is just sort of the latest phenomena that helps us to address these questions. Unfortunately, humanities scholars haven't started dealing with this type of phenomenon, but there's no reason why they couldn't and won't eventually, when they start realizing what it is and how it shapes, as I mentioned earlier, everyday psychology or cultures or traditions or customs or things like diversity. And I think, you'll find some sort of left-wing activists that are waking up to what ESG
Yeah.
does. And
Yep.
you could, within the next 5 or 6 years, find some very interesting alliances between social conservatives and sort
Hmm.
of leftist activists when they start realizing how there's a concentration of power and an
Hmm.
enrichment among select firms occurring at the expense of everybody else and going under what purports to be this great, lovely thing called ESG.
Yeah, I think a kind of an heartening and encouraging thought that, and I'm seeing a lot of very unusual alliances on the political sphere that I really never anticipated. So I think people are starting to ask questions fundamentally about, I mean, the classical liberal sort of experiment is changing, and I think people are saying, wait a sec, is that maybe something we don't really want to desert right now? And so I'm seeing some interesting allegiances that I never thought I would actually see in my in my lifetime. Do you feel like literature uniquely prepared you to tackle the subjects that you're on that maybe you wouldn't have been prepared for had you not had that backing or that training?
Possibly.
Sorry, I'm really getting
That's
out of the box here.
no, it's possible. It's a difficult thing to measure. Obviously, literature, at least studying in a doctoral level, requires a form of mastery over communication. Um, the other thing that literature did is literary studies is very heavily influenced by theory now. And I was actually a man of the left as an undergraduate because I
Mm,
wasn't intellectually mature yet. And I had to read nothing but Marxism as a literature student,
interesting.
both as an undergraduate and a graduate. And it actually was an aversion to what I was reading that led me to markets. I kept
What
reading
books?
Marxism. Well, I mean, anybody from Althusser to, flat out Marx himself to all forms of French post-structuralism and structuralism, I began to reject this sort of deterministic view of society in which we are all just products of systems and structures and
Hmm.
had no agency whatsoever. We were all just conditioned products, as if we were little, things put into a machine and coughed out to believe certain things. I just didn't. I just didn't believe that. I do believe that we are sort of products of history and we are embedded in our historical moment and therefore can't think. Our scope is necessarily limited. We can't imagine what it's going to be like to think from some other context, which is the reason why we don't want to be too arrogant when we are presentist in our thinking, when we look back and condemn past generations for not living up to standards that we hold today. Well,
Yeah.
we're going to have standards that obviously won't live up to some future
Correct.
standard either.
Yep.
So I do believe that we are sort of historically bound or situated, and that our cultures are nested and circumscribed to a certain extent. But that doesn't mean that we cannot exercise agency within those parameters in which we're inevitably placed. And and it also most assuredly does not mean that we can be excused from accountability for wrong actions, or that we're justified in pursuing wrong courses of action in order to make up for bad acts in the past. It's the whole
Hmm.
two wrongs don't make a right thing. Just because, for example, practices that were discriminatory based on race were prevalent at one time in the past, that we need to now embrace those as a form of retribution or retaliation for past sins. I don't think that that's the solution, that that's the way out
It's
of
a it's a
problems.
contradiction.
Right.
Yeah, it's a
Exactly.
contradiction. So it sounds like you kind of were exposed to Marxist conflict theory, to
Correct.
sort of systems-based critical theory, and you said, I'm just not buying this.
I
Uh,
was
it,
fascinated by. I mean, it's fascinating. It's great
it is
reading, but
fascinating. I've
I
read
didn't
much of
buy
that
into
too.
it.
Yeah,
Yeah, I didn't.
I've
I
read.
wasn't sold.
I've read a fair bit of Marx as well, and I mean I was a skeptic to begin with, but then when you read it, you're like, I thought he made a few fair points about oppression, but I didn't buy his entire paradigm. That I
Right.
just like, okay, so the working class was treated unfairly. I think there's plenty of evidence to suggest that there were moments where they were treated unfairly, but to suggest that the entire theory therefore makes sense, and when it's just power dynamics where one power group takes over the other power group. It's just this constant. That's why it's conflict there. There's this constant conflict that revolves again and again and again. And then when you take reins of power, how do you not become then the new oppressor? Because it's oppressor versus oppressed. And so you can never reconcile that. So then at what point are you now the oppressor? And you're the one with the systemic and institutional power. And I think we're starting to see society start to question some of those things the way you did, which does give me a little bit of hope.
Yeah, my entire worldview, if I can use that term, is sort of predicated on epistemology. You mentioned Presbyterian earlier. I'm a Presbyterian PCA. I have a very low opinion of human nature and of our ability to know things, which necessarily drew me to a wide variety of thinkers, whether it was Tocqueville or Burke on the conservative side.
I love Burke.
Or Hayek and Ostrom on the sort of classical liberal side. Or Russell Kirk also on the conservative side to a certain extent. And so, that's sort of my tradition, an Oakshottian tradition. I would throw him in there as well. Cool. And, I'm very skeptical of many sort of claims to sort of acontextual knowledge or, I just have a very low opinion of the human capacity to reason. I also believe we have awesome powers. Don't get me wrong, that we are very intelligent creatures and have full agency and free will and these sorts of things. But I'm very skeptical about our ability to come up with, in particular, anything utopian whatsoever. I don't believe that we're going to ever find perfection here in this tangible, concrete world in which we live. And that the best we can do is sort of learn to accommodate differences and live civilly and peacefully.
A book I reference often is Thomas Sowell's Conflict of Visions.
Yeah, it's a great book.
Awesome book. And there's the constrained versus the unconstrained, and the Marxist theorists, right? So whether it's Rousseau's at a different time frame, but whether it's Rousseau, whether it's Marx, whether it's some of these other philosophical theorists, they believed in an unconstrained view of humanity. There was a belief in, to an extent, the ability to perfect oneself, where those that would subscribe to, say, like the PCA, for instance, holds in a Calvinist theology, then they believe in an idea known as depravity. So they believe that humanity is marred by sin and imperfection due to the fall. But then there's a lot of other theorists, whether it's Adam Smith, whether it's Hayek, whether it's Russell Kirk. All those names that you mentioned would fall under a constrained view of humanity. I mean, the Wealth of Nations itself by Adam Smith is really a document largely on the nature of humanity, and that humans are not always in it for the purest reasons. And, he was really stabbing, I think, at incentives and markets. So I agree with you totally. I think there's just no way we're going to reach this utopian perfectionistic state. And I don't think history bears that out. And so to honor Sowell, I think we just both believe in a constrained vision of humanity.
100%. I'm with you on that constrained view. And the first time I read Conflict of Visions, I was very young and immature and didn't like it. And then I went back and read it several years later, over a decade later, and found the constrained view to be exactly where I fell.
Yeah, same. When I read it, I was like, man, he's nailing it. I get it now. I get it.
Yeah.
Hey, Alan, this has been so much fun. I know we're a little over on time. I really appreciate you being here, and this is a great time.
Well, thanks for having me. I really appreciate it, and I enjoyed the conversation.
Likewise.